Would you like to grow more plants in less space and get a bigger harvest as a result? Well, then you probably need to learn to grow up and not out. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, a master gardener who discusses everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. And today, I'll show you how I grow a vertical garden. The concept of vertical gardening is not to grow tall plants like this sunflower behind me, but rather to grow most of your vining and spreading plants vertically up, rather than let them grow sideways and sprawl across garden beds. Now, I have another video that discusses why vertical gardening can really be beneficial for you, your garden, and your harvests. This video is going to focus more on how I do it, how I trellis, how I put my plants in the ground, how I tie them up, and how I get the benefits of a vertical garden. Many of our garden plants are quite well suited for vertical gardening because they want to grow tall. Plants like our tomatoes and green beans. If we give them something to grow on, a trellis, they will grow up. Now, without the trellis, they're just going to sprawl across the ground and take up a lot of space. So for a vertical garden, the key is trellising the plants vertically. And this trellis needs to be strong enough for the plants that are going to grow up. But the trellis doesn't need to be anything fancy. For these tomatoes, I just have some old tree branches that I tied together to create a trellis. You don't have to spend a lot to make it. It just needs to be strong enough for the plants. And this limb is strong enough for the tomatoes that will be growing up. For the cucumbers in this bed, I'm using some deck railing. Now, if you don't know what this is, imagine that it's turned sideways so that all of these pieces are now vertical. Well, this is what you put around a deck so you don't fall off. I had some pieces left over after a deck renovation years ago, and now I just turn it, bury it into the soil, and it's ideal as a trellis for cucumbers. For my tomatoes that I have growing in the straw bale and in these grow bags, I just have these metal rods. Simple, one piece to help support this tomato as it grows vertically. This trellis for these indeterminate tomatoes is simple as well. It's just 2 T-posts sunk at either end, and then I'm running twine back and forth using a Florida weave, and it's this twine that essentially becomes the trellis for these tomatoes. I really like to use cattle panels to make some of my trellises, and so this is set up as an A-frame to support some squash and green beans. These hoops are set up to support the tomatoes. Now, after I show you a couple more options for vertical growing trellises, I'll show you exactly how I tie them up and I get the plants to grow using the trellis as support. You may be wondering why I have so many different types of trellises. Well, first, I like to experiment and I like trying new things, new types of trellises. But more importantly, I have different trellises for different plants and for different beds. For example, in this bed I've got beets growing at the end, I've got some turnips here that I'm letting go to seed, I've got some chard behind me, and right in the middle I have some cucumbers growing. Well, if the cucumbers were left to themselves, they really don't have much room to grow. But by setting up another A-frame within this bed filled with plants, I can grow cucumbers. I like to use the tall hoops made out of cattle panels for my tomatoes because they're going to get quite long and fill the space. I like to use these low hoops made out of cattle panels as well. In this bed, I have squash and cucumbers that are being supported by this lower, really nice cattle panel trellis. Using the full length of the cattle panel, I created this garden arch. Now I have some gourds growing on this side, I've got some honeysuckle and grapes growing on the other side. They'll gradually fill up this arch. Now it's a decorative element in my garden, but it's also a really nice strong trellis. I also used a full-length cattle panel horizontally as a trellis in this tomato bed. Now there's 12 tomatoes here that are going to be growing up and putting their full weight of the plant and the fruit on this trellis. So it needed to be strong. It's the strongest in my garden. I've got it anchored with some really tall T-posts. You don't have to go to this extreme. You can start with just the single pole, or spend some extra time and effort and money, of course, when you have a sturdier trellis to support your plants as they grow vertically. So you've seen all the different trellises that I have in my garden, but they're absolutely worthless unless I train the plants to grow vertically. Naturally, gravity is going to have an effect, and so all of these vining plants are going to fall and then grow horizontally. It takes action by the gardener to train the plants to grow vertically. And there's really two primary ways of doing that. We can physically attach the plant to the trellis, or we can give the plant something to grow up and then guide it as it's growing in that vertical direction. And I'll show you the different methods I use with each of the trellises. I'm directing the growth of these cucumbers by physically tying them to this trellis. By using just normal garden twine and using a very loose loop, they're attached to the trellis, and I weave the vines in and out of the trellis, and it will fully support their growth and all of the heavy cucumbers that will result. I'm using the other method to support the cucumbers growing underneath this cattle panel hoop. I have twine tied to the top and then extending down to the base of the plants. And as the plants grow, I weave them around the twine, and that helps direct their growth. Particularly with the cucumbers, the tendrils will grab onto this twine and continue to grow vertically. And I do this with all of the individual plants that are growing throughout this bed. For these tomatoes that are growing up the stake, I have some plant clips that are just holding the plant against the stake. I'm actually using both methods to trellis the tomatoes on this long horizontal trellis. I started with the twine to direct the growth when the plants were still pretty small, and then once they got high enough where they were able to reach the horizontal trellis, well, then I went with the plant clips. So the twine is holding a portion of the plant. The plant clips is holding another portion of the plant. And again, I weave these plants in and out through the trellis. So I don't even need clips or twine after they reach a certain point. The plant grows essentially to the trellis and is held in place by its own growth. For the tomatoes growing in my favorite tomato trellis, the twine is supporting almost the entire weight of the plant. So I use a heavy-duty nylon twine that won't break under the pressure. And then I just train all these plants vertically. The way I do that is by using tomato clips to hold the plants to the twine. And each plant will end up having 3 or 4 of these tomato clips as it grows. Eventually, the plant will get big enough, tall enough, that some of the branches will start growing through the sides of this trellis. And like with the other one, the growth of the plant will help support its total weight. But the trellis is strong enough to do that. For these green beans, I didn't even attach the twine to the plant at all. I just dangled it from above, and the natural growth and the grabbing tendrils is enough to get these beans growing vertically. Cucumbers also do a pretty good job with their tendrils grabbing on to the twine, but that doesn't happen until they get relatively large. So I'll start by attaching a tomato clip to the plant, and then again I'll weave the plant around the twine to help hold it in position. And as it grows, the tendrils will grab on. You can also grow squash vertically, even zucchini. I have a lot of yellow squash plants in this bed. As they grew, the plants on the outside, well, I directed their branches and their leaves outside of the trellis. So as they grew, their own leaves were supporting their vertical growth. The plants in the middle were supported by the plants on the outside. And so now, with the outside being supported by the trellis and the inside being supported by other plants, pretty much all of the squash plants in this bed are growing vertically now. I'm doing it differently with this squash plant. Now, I didn't put this squash plant here on purpose. This is supposed to be all green beans, but it showed up, it started growing pretty well, I decided to leave it. Well, a single squash plant needs guidance to grow vertically. So for this one, I went ahead and attached the twine at the base using a loose loop, and then directed the growth of the plant, again wrapping it around the twine so that I can get that vertical growth. The twine is also critical in this trellising method of these tomatoes. You tie the twine to one end and then you weave it back and forth among the tomato plants. And then when you get to the other side, you come back and you weave it in the opposite direction. So what you have is a plant that's supported by one twine on one side and another twine on the other side. And you keep repeating this as the plant grows taller. It does take extra effort and sometimes extra expense to build a trellis and then attach the plant to it. But the payback is spectacular. You get to grow more plants in less space and you get a lot more harvest. So I think the effort is definitely worth it. And that's why I do so much vertical gardening throughout my garden. If you want to learn more about vertical gardening and other aspects of the garden, well then click on one of these GardenerScott videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.